So the case study that our group has chosen to research and present as part of this project is entitled Alcohol Product Placements and the Third Person Effect. So this case study was done in 2011 by Shin and Kim. And it has to do with television and new media, as well as the third person effect. So this group project is presented by Mackenzie Moore, Wayne Peterson, and Gemma Smith for Strategic Communication Theory. So jumping right in, we will go over our questions for thought. So these are 5 questions that we should keep in the back of our minds as we reach the conclusion of this case study. So starting out, we asked ourselves the question, how do young people and their parents feel about seeing alcohol in movies? And do they think that it affects young viewers? Our second question is, are the effects of alcohol in youth films similar to how people feel about other types of advertising? Why or why not? Number 3, should there be more rules and guidelines on how much alcohol is shown in youth films? Number 4, do younger viewers believe that films with alcohol influence their friends differently than themselves? And number 5, have you ever felt like people around you seem more influenced by media or advertising than you are? And if so, why or why not? So these 5 questions take us into the next part of our presentation, which is where we will talk about what is the third person effect exactly. It's kind of a broad idea that we will be using as we go through this case study. So the third person effect is the idea that people tend to perceive that mass media messages have a much larger effect on everybody else, basically, than the messages' effect on themselves. And it's all based on personal biases. So next up, we'll talk a little bit about the background of the study. So using the third person effect, this study investigates whether and to what degree the third person effect functions in the special case of alcohol product placement in youth-oriented movies. It also investigates the influence of demographic, perceptual, and attitudinal variables, and additionally, the relationship between perceived third-person effects and support for alcohol product placement regulation in youth movies. So we have a few research questions that were referenced in this case study. So the first one, does the magnitude of the third-person perception differ according to the 2 different effects of alcohol product placements, such as drinking and brand effects? The second question is, when taken as a group of predictors, so self-esteem, self-perceived knowledge, issue involvement, perceived fit, and perceived desirability, which of the factors under examination will be the strongest predictor of the size of the third person effect? And number 3, how will college students' third person perceptions and their perceived effects on themselves and others, separately and jointly, be related to support for the regulation of alcohol product placement in youth-oriented movies? So these 3 questions are not the hypotheses that will come next, but these are the questions that inspired the researchers to actually conduct the research and draw conclusions from there. So now we can talk about the actual hypotheses. So the first one, college students will perceive alcohol product placement in youth-oriented movies to exert greater influence on others than on themselves. So just to give you a little bit more context here, this hypothesis is based on the well-established third-person effect, which we talked about previously in this presentation. And our second hypothesis is as follows. As social distance increases, the magnitude of the third-person perception increases. So children, greater than teens, greater than other college students. And for a little more context on this one as well, this is based on the notion that children may be seen as more distant from themselves than other adults, and therefore This potentially makes them more vulnerable to message effects that are visible in advertising, primarily movies. So then we ask the question, how does it affect the youth? And basically, the portrayal of alcohol in youth movies conveys messages about drinking that may encourage young people to drink. Underage drinking is often treated humorously, and the seriousness of problematic drinking is often overlooked. So people make jokes about these things, but a lot of people neglect to realize the seriousness of it and how common it is in everyday media. So we can see that 67% of teens and 72% of adults agreed that beer and liquor companies target underage drinkers. So we start to think a little bit about why this could be, bringing us back to our 5 questions for thought. We think that beer ads influence children's intentions to drink as adults. And those who expected to drink more frequently as adults also believed that their peers were more approving of drinking and their parents drank more frequently. And this brings us to the data collection of this study. So a survey was administered to college students from a large southeastern university. This is how the researchers conducted their study. This is the methodology that was used. So this survey was measured using a 7-point scale, which ranged from not at all to very much so. And it included the following subtopics. Number 1, self-esteem. Number 2, self-perceived knowledge. Number 3, issue involvement. Number 4, perceived fit. Number 5, perceived desirability. Number 6, support for regulation. And number 7, perceived desirability of alcohol product placement. And that brings us to our next slide here, where we will be talking about the findings. So our first hypothesis, this is a quote directly from the case study. Authors Shin and Kim said that the summated mean of alcohol product placement effects on others was significantly different from those on the self. And they also presented some data here on this. The mean difference was 1.92 on the t-test, which was the method used to present this data. And you can see here in table 2, the t-test between effects on the self and effects on others. You can see that data is presented there. Now we also have our results for hypothesis number 2. And another quote from the authors here, Shin and Kim. They say that a greater perceptual difference existed not for the youngest target group, children younger than 13, but for the middle target group, which was ages 13 to 17, with regard to the 4 types of alcohol product placement effects. And you can see in table 4 that data is presented to us, the data on effects on self and effects on others for summated effects. Taking a look at our next slide, we've been presented a lot of data now, and now we've got to make sense of this. So it's a broad topic to discuss, but we can come up with an interpretation of these findings. So the study, the authors confirmed that the relationship between third-person perception and the willingness to regulate media content is most likely to appear in the context of socially undesirable entertainment and advertising. These findings and the interpretation of such findings were consistent with the findings of existing third-person effect research, so research that has been previously done on this concept. Now, there were some limitations of the study. We'll talk about that here. So the study fails, in a way, to consider the following: that results may vary when considering messaging types, cultural differences, and perceived communicator intent. So what that means is that there could be differences in the ways that culture is different. effects. So a quote from the authors here is as follows: possible contextual variations that might influence the third person effect should be examined. So they ask the question, do such effects vary as a function of message type? For example, political news, advertising, opinion polls, perceived communicator intent, which gives rise to differential attributions, and cultural context. And what the authors are saying when they say cultural context is the third person effect less pronounced in Asian cultures, which tend to stress the interrelatedness of the person to the social environment? Then, in comparison, in conventional Western cultures, which emphasize the uniqueness of the individual. So the authors suggest that to win public support for branded alcohol placement in movies, communication messages should be sufficiently persuasive to cause the public to perceive the message as socially desirable so as not to elicit unintended communication effects such as the third person perception. So moving on to our next slide, where we will talk about implications of this study and what this study means going forward. So what are the effects on the advertising industry? So the third person effects caused by alcohol movie placement advertisements may be a strong predictor of support for alcohol ad regulation, whether this comes from governments, parents, or advertising agencies themselves, or schools, for example. And as far as our policymakers go, an argument could be made for increased regulation involving advertisements. So, as mentioned before, this might include governments, parental and advertising agency figures. So it confirms that if people consider a message negative and socially undesirable, it is thought that a greater perceived third-person effect will lead them to support communication regulation. However, one might argue that the third-person effect and support for the regulation of alcohol product placement and movies are just simply correlated without one causing the other. Therefore, the significant positive relationship could be better understood through examining its related factors for strong evidence that the perceived effects can lead to actual effects, specifically support for the regulation. And our conclusion of this study brings us to several key findings. So first of all, the relationship between third-person perception and willingness to regulate media content is most likely to appear in the context of socially undesirable entertainment and advertising alike. Now, the research of this case study, it is in fact consistent with the findings of existing third-person effect research, as we have previously discussed. Now we come to several recommendations for what's next. After we learn about this study, we can ask ourselves, is it possible that filmmakers should consider the implications of presenting alcohol advertisements in their movies? And we can ask ourselves questions such as, how can we fulfill the brand's needs in a positive way if we're making a movie, for example? Can we show the product and also demonstrate the risks of said product in a way that educates the public, but also keeps the artistic vision of the director, the producer, anybody who is in charge of making and producing this film? And that brings us to the end of our presentation. We have our references listed here. We hope that you enjoyed learning a little bit about alcohol product placements, especially in movies and with youth, as well as the concept of the third person effect through this case study.